press and tension around the U.S. relations with nuclearizing North Korea. And if you want to know why do they hate us, go learn something about the Korean War and what we did to North Korea. It was horrendous. And part of the story, maybe the ugliest and most suppressed part, is this massive use of bioweapons. I've read Dave Chaddock's book, This Must Be the Place, which makes a really good case that this actually happened. And Tom Powell's work also looks to be a very important contribution to this topic. So we're going to bring him up too. First up, we've got Jeff Brown. Welcome, Jeff. How are you?
I'm doing great. How about you, Kevin? Good to hear your voice again.
I'm doing well. Good to have you back. You're coming through loud and clear from the other side of the world. I think you're in China still, right?
Yeah, I'm in Shenzhen.
Cool. Okay. And now we're bringing up Thomas Powell, whose research on this issue really needs to reach a wider audience. So, hey, welcome, Tom. How are you?
Well, thank you very much, Kevin.
Okay, great to have you. Now, Tom, if you have any way to speak up loud and clear or crank up your volume a little bit, that'd be great. You're a little low. So this is how can Americans not know about this? I mean, we know that we dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You learn that in third grade, pretty much. If you get past the 6th or 7th or 8th grade, you probably will learn that we firebombed German and Japanese cities, creating these hellish firestorms that consumed tens, or in a couple of cases, over 100,000 people. Innocent civilians, roasted them by the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, committing terrorism, according to the definition of that term. So we kind of know that stuff, but almost nobody has heard that the U.S. used germ warfare in the Korean War. How was that? How did that get covered up so effectively?
Go ahead, Tom. You start, and I'll follow on.
Okay. Well, I think there are several answers to that question. Probably the first is that it wasn't very effective. And because there were no huge outbreaks of epidemics in China and North Korea, that it was much easier to cover it up. I think if it had been successful and widespread epidemics had occurred, then it would not have been easy to cover it up, and it would have become quite public, and perhaps the Army would have bragged about it. But that, I think, is the first reason. And also then the confessions of the pilots who were engaged in it, they were all appalled by what they had been forced to do, essentially. And that was very damning evidence that it became obvious that the American public would not tolerate this kind of warfare, that nobody had the stomach for it. And I think that was an impetus too. And also the Korean War was full of atrocities. There's the horrific atrocities at the prison camps on Kochi Island, where many prisoners were shot, hung, tattooed, beaten, just horrific treatment of prisoners of war by surrogate soldiers, camp guards from the Kuomintang Army of Taiwan. And so there's a lot of reasons, and those are three.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jeff. Well, I'd just like to add that I actually wrote a chapter about all the biowarfare and chemicals and everything that in my second book about China Rising. And when someone sent me a link to with Tom's article, his first article, where he exposed that, I was really upset because I had spent hundreds of hours researching America in particular, but the West, chronic use of chemical warfare and biowarfare, not only on, the poor and the wretched of the planet, but even on their own people many, many times. So I got a hold of Tom and contacted him. We had a wonderful interview. And so that's kind of where this all started. And I found out about the International Scientific Commission report that came out in 1952, headed up by one of the greatest sinologists and one of the great anthropologists and scientists of the 20th century, Joseph Needham. And it struck me how suppressed this report was, and to the point that in 2015, a stray copy was actually found in a used bookstore in the UK, and it was actually auctioned off. So what I learned is that once Needham's report came out, I mean, there were 10 scientists came out. The evidence was just, and we'll talk about it later. We finally got copies, and we're making them public for the first time in 70 years. The evidence is so overwhelming about American use of bioweapons in Korea that, you know, the usual suspects, the CIA types, the MI6 types, they started scooping up copies, you know, left and right, to the point where no one had seen a copy in decades. So that's why I didn't know about it. It has literally, the whole bioweapons story and the proof of it actually having been committed, the International Scientific Commission report, 667 pages of bulletproof evidence, was just viciously and proactively censored and suppressed by the governments of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, you know, the North America, etc. So that's how much the West has gone out of its way to just bury this reality.
Interesting. Well, there's actually a link between this war crime or series of war crimes and the more recent series of war crimes, including the torture that's been used as a matter of national policy since 9/11. It was maybe reeled back in a little bit under Obama, and now under Trump, apparently. We love torture, you know, torture works, as Trump says. And there's a connection to this Korean situation, because the pilots who'd been captured after dropping bioweapons on North Korea, who then went ahead and told the truth about it while they were in captivity, when they came home to the U.S., their story had to somehow be erased. And so they made up this story of brainwashing. That is, the idea that the Koreans had come up with some brilliant way of totally brainwashing people and making them just say whatever their captors wanted and actually believe it. And that then became the main focus of the kind of torture, mind control through torture, reverse engineering by the armed forces and the intelligence community here in the U.S.
with MK Ultra and all that.
Dragged back out after 9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, MK Ultra and Project Monarch and all that stuff was going on as well. But post 9/11, they went and they got the manuals, basically, that had been reverse engineered after this alleged torture brainwashing from Korea, which actually most of it never happened. So there's that interesting sort of thread linking these two war crimes.
Tom, do you have any comments?
The CIA really got interested in torture in the 1950s, and they really have perfected their techniques. They've gone to a lot of trouble, hired psychologists and psychiatrists to help them devise plans to engage in physical and psychological torture, and they projection blamed the Chinese and the Koreans for exactly what they were doing themselves. And that has been a tactic of the covert community and the U.S. covert community in particular, is you blame the other for your own deeds.
It's called psychological projection. That's what they call it.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
The Frank Olson case is an interesting case there. Frank Olson was apparently part of some of these torture experiments, which in more than 100 cases led to the death of the subject. That means the CIA tortured more than 100 people to death. These were mostly prisoners in Europe. And Olson wasn't too happy about what he'd done. Then he ended up taking a plunge out of I forget what story window it was, while under the influence of LSD. And a bunch of cover stories were generated about this, but it turns out the truth was that he couldn't live with the stuff he had done, including this torturing people to death for the CIA, and he was going to start talking about it. So
Yeah.
they dosed him with LSD and they threw him out the window.
Yeah, the what happened, in fact, George Burchett, Wilfred Burchett's son, he's also joined our American Bioweapons Truth Commission that we've established and will be rolling out here later this year with the global online library. He just reported, Earl Morris, the great documentarian. He just came out a couple of months ago on Netflix with a movie about Olson called Wormwood. And it revolves around just sort of like Tom and his parents, John and Sylvia Powell, and George, Wilfred, the son of Wilfred Burchett, all these children of these people who were so persecuted and devastated during the 50s and 60s. Olson's son is central to the movie. Now, I have not seen it yet, but I read George Burchett's review of the movie, and they actually exhumed his body, Frank Olson's body, and had an independent coroner do all the forensic analysis on it, and his head was smashed in before he...
Just like Thomas Merton. In the first hour, we talked about the Thomas Merton likely assassination. And there again, Merton supposedly died of a faulty fan. He was supposedly electrocuted by a fan, and he was found lying down with a fan on top of him, but the back of his head was caved in.
Yeah,
and in fact, so it sort of got pushed to the side in the official biographies and the official stories of that. Yeah.
Let me jump.
Go ahead.
If I may, Olson seemed to have had a change of heart. That he was not really emotionally or psychologically equipped to be a black ops type of person. That he was a scientist and a scholar, and he was recruited out of college by his professors to come to work for the government at Camp Detrick. And he was quite brilliant, and he figured out how to turn anthrax into a form of pneumonia, turn an animal disease into a human disease, and it became a weapon. And then once the CIA recruited him and he became an operative with the CIA, and they started dragging him into these viewing these torture tactics they were using in Europe, he rebelled. He was revolted by this, and I think he wanted out. And he probably, rather unjudiciously, said he was going to spill the beans on his research at Camp Detrick if they let him out, and that's why they clubbed him and dropped him out the window.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So the moral of the story is you don't say that you're going to spill the beans, you just spill them.
Yeah. Like WikiLeaks, like on WikiLeaks.
Exactly. So speaking of which, how are you guys going to distribute this ISCR report on the bioweapons in Korea?
Tom, do you mind if I go ahead?
Yeah, go for it, Jeff.
Yeah, what we did is it's a long and interesting story, but we another member of what has now become the founding group of the American Bioweapons Truth Commission is Godfrey Roberts, based in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and he's an outstanding researcher. And I actually found the books here with antique book dealers in Chinese, and I was trying to find them in English, and I said to Godfrey, I said, man, we really need to find this thing in English. Well, he used to be a professor at a university on the East Coast, and he was able to get behind their sort of, professorial firewall, and he actually found the ISCR in English in PDF form, and so we finally got what we were, what the CIA and the MI6 has been vociferously censoring and suppressing, since 1952, and in honor of and also Godfrey, we got it transcribed into text form, so that now you can do word search and copy and paste. And then Tom, I think in November, wrote a second article, a follow-on article about about America's bioweapons in Korea. And Godfrey and I felt like Tom deserved. This was before we knew George Burchett, because his father definitely also would deserve the honors too, because of what the United States did to try to destroy him. But anyway, Tom actually posted the ISCR in English and in text form in his second article. And so we felt like he deserved the honors. And so that was in November. Then another guy joined our group, Jeff Kay. He actually is someone who works with torture victims, and so has a lot of experience in that area. And his specialty is the pilot's confessions. And so that's our group now. That's the American Bioweapons Truth Commission is the sixth. Oh, and then David Pear, Vietnam veteran, saw some bad stuff over there, really bad stuff, and he's become, a spokesman, and he is also very educated and has been to Korea, etc. So now we just put an article out kind of announcing this officially just last week. And Kevin, if you don't mind, I'll give you the link, and if you'd please put it in your article, your introduction, I'd really appreciate it, where we listed the ISCR in English, PDF, English text, Chinese PDF, Chinese text, and I'm gonna mutilate it. But there was also the famous trials in 1950 in Russia. Tom, can you help me? The Khabarovsk Khabarov trials, where they tried the members of the Unit 731, the infamous Japanese center in Harbin, China, where they were doing vivisections on humans and putting poison and toxins in them and everything while they were still alive.
So what's the connection between the Japanese use of these horrible weapons and all other war criminal type behavior against China and Korea? And then the U.S. Doing very similar things right afterwards.
Yeah, please, Tom. I think you're eminently qualified to talk about this. Go ahead.
That's a rather interesting story. Towards the end of the war, when it was apparent that things were going poorly, and then we dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan essentially capitulated. Shiro Ishii, who was the commandant of Unit 731 near Harbin, China, realized he had to get out. And I think he knew it beforehand and planned his escape. But he and his top scientists there at the Unit 731 burned the place down, took about 8,000 slides and a lot of their research, and got down the Korean peninsula and commandeered passage over to Japan and went into hiding. And then they got a guy named Ryoichi Naito to act as a broker for them. And they brokered this through this intermediary to General MacArthur. And MacArthur didn't know what to think of it, and he asked for backup, and the Army sent him a guy from Camp Dietrich who was working on bioweapons for the U.S. And this guy went over and interviewed some of the and looked at the material that these scientists had, and he recommended to MacArthur that yes, we really can use this. And MacArthur then granted immunity from prosecution, from war crimes prosecution, and forced everybody all the way up to Truman to back him up on it. The Secretary of State, Atchison, and everybody had to fall in line once MacArthur, because he was like an emperor over in China, in Japan after the war. He was very powerful, and so he called the shots, and that essentially caused the Truman administration to fall into step. And it was a very fateful step, and so they did. They granted immunity to Ishii and to his subordinates, with the caveat that they help him out to making this stuff useful. And they did, in fact, work. General Ishii made a couple of trips to the United States. It's also reported that he was seen in South Korea during the war. So that's the connection. The U.S. then acquired the entirety of this research that had been done, 15 years of research by the Japanese army into biowarfare. And they had experimented on a great number of prisoners that they held at their camp there. And a lowball estimate is they killed at least 3,000 people. And probably it's at least 3 or 4 times that many. And they incinerated the evidence at the camp there, so nobody really knows how many people died there. But they perfected a number of diseases and made them human contagions. And they spread these diseases over China and Siberia with various different bombs that they had devised, ceramic bombs and different means. And because this whole area was in chaos and it was up in war and there was no civil government, there was no way of fighting it, and it was extremely effective. I've read estimates of 400,000 people were killed by infectious diseases originating from Unit 731 and Unit 100. And so that's what, so Ishii was able to show evidence of the successful BW program and convinced both his handlers in the United States and the Army, the Japanese Army, Imperial Army, of the effectiveness of this disease. And so he talked it up, and the U.S. bought right into it.
Kevin, can I add?
Reminds us a little bit of this, the Nazi scientists brought over, Werner von Braun was just the most famous. After World War II, it does seem that we emerged with a mythical narrative of the ultimate evil that we defeated, personified as Hitler. We were the good guys, but then after the war, we took all these people who've been involved with the nasty stuff that our enemies had done, not that we weren't doing at least as much nasty stuff ourselves, and we brought them over and employed them to help us develop even nastier stuff. That somehow doesn't make it into the public myth that we put in our high school textbooks.
I'd like to add for our listeners out there, a lot of people don't know Camp Dietrich is in the United States, and it was the original biochemical, chemical, germ warfare. It's an army base. I think it's in Maryland.
It's called
Fort Detrick.
Yeah, Fort Detrick. And then the United States was working hand in hand with the British, and they had a very similar center called Porton Down. I'm not sure where it is in England, and they worked hand in hand and shared information. I would like to just add to what Tom said is that if you look at what Ishii showed the United States with all the evidence that he gave them, and the how the vectors and using voles and mice and flies and ceramic bombs with with infected insects and small mammals and things like that. You look at all that, and then you look at what the International Science Commission report showed with just tons of photographic plates. It's literally, it's obvious that the United States just basically copied the Unit 731's playbook. And so the connection is just, it's so clear, it's undeniable. But of course, everybody, as you said, we have these myths. And so I just wanted to point those two things out. There's no doubt about the fact that the United States benefited tremendously from Ishii's 15 something back in the 30s. He was early 30s. He started Unit 731 after the Japanese invaded Manchuria, and so it's there's absolutely no doubt. Just like you said, we brought in tens of thousands of Nazis after the war, put them to work in Gladio. Put them to work in South America, put them to work, just doing all kinds of horrific things. Again, the hypocritical, shiny temple on the hill, hiding behind, or hiding all of these evil projects that they have been doing since at least World War II.
Absolutely. Well, a question that arises based on what you've said is, if Unit 731, the Japanese biowar unit, was so effective in attacking Manchuria and Siberia during the 30s and 40s and killed up to 500,000 plus people there, why was the U.S. effort, which basically took over the work of Unit 731 and Ishii, who'd been turned and now he's working for the Americans. So the Americans then used this stuff in the Korean War. And you said earlier that the biggest reason why it's not better known is that it wasn't very effective. So why was it so much more effective used by the Japanese
Go ahead.
In the 30s and 40s?
Go ahead, Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
I asked that question. It wasn't effective for two reasons. First, there was a rush to push it into place. That in the order to give the order given to start the bioweapon, the attacks, the actual air attacks, the dropping of bombs, occurred probably in November of 1951, and it became operational. And they started it then. There was a rush to get it going and getting it into place. And so they started it in December in the middle of winter. And the ground was frozen, there was snow everywhere, and they were dropping containers that had insects, and the insects were immobilized by the cold. And so it was discovered out very quickly by the Chinese and the Koreans exactly what was happening, and they were all very well aware of the history of Unit 731, and they all knew about General Ishii, and they were on the lookout for this. And so that was the first thing, is the initial attack was completely ineffective because it was done at a time of year
when it's minus 20.
Yeah, that's mind-bogglingly stupid. I mean, here in Wisconsin, in the epicenter of the Lyme disease epidemic, which many people believe was brought to us from the biological testing grounds on Long Island, right across from West Lyme, Connecticut, where it first showed up. But here in Wisconsin, we don't get Lyme disease ticks very much in the dead of January. It's 20 degrees below zero.
It was stupid. It was not well thought out, but there was a rush to do something because MacArthur was very concerned that there was going to be a third assault from the communist forces that the Chinese were building up, and they could have sustained. He was concerned they could sustain an assault, and they had been pushed back at this time back to the 38th parallel, and the U.S. Had occupied Seoul, and they were afraid of losing Seoul, and so that this then became sort of the go-to strategy to try to beat off a third wave, a third assault. And so the other thing is that the Chinese were incredibly well organized, and I've been reading the work of Wu Zili, who was a soldier and medic, and they were able to institute very, very basic public health methods of catching and suppressing these vectors. That they had crews, as soon as a plane passed over and something was spotted falling, they were able to send out containment troops that would go out there and they'd round stuff up and burn it on the site. They instituted very strict quarantines and public health inoculations. They ordered many thousands, millions actually, doses of vaccines from the Russians, who provided them a great deal of support in this way, and medical staff people. And it was really the public, very simple, very basic public health methods. They were able to suppress it and maintain it and keep it at a very low infection rate and quarantine off areas where infections had begun.
If I can just quickly add, yeah, the Chinese, MacArthur, of course, famously said, "I'm going to go to the Yalu River, the Chinese border, and we're going to go into China," and etc. Mao said, "It's not going to happen." His forces, poured over the Yalu River, drove MacArthur back, not past the 38th parallel, and again they were worried that that Mao was going to continue to literally push the Americans off the peninsula, so they were scared to death about that. And then another reason that it was not very effective is a lot of people don't know. Of course, it's one of the great genocidal crimes against humanity. The United States carpet bombed North Korea with more tonnage of bombs than all of the bombs dropped in both theaters during World War II. They dropped significantly more tonnage than all of the bombs dropped in World War II in a country the size of Indiana. And so what the North Koreans did is it's a very mountainous, rugged country. So they literally went in and just built underground shelters, just thousands and thousands and thousands of underground shelters. And so every time planes would come over, they would, run into these shelters. And so they basically, the United States was bombing the villages, but many of the people were underground. So when the bioweapons planes flew over, I don't know about China, but at least in North Korea, they were trained to immediately, run into their underground bunkers. And that's another reason it was not very effective.
Well, this helps us understand the attitude of North Korea today.
Oh, God.
They're quite bellicose towards the U.S., and here in our mainstream media, it's portrayed as though they're just crazy. Like, why would they hate us? We're such nice guys. This truth about history can help us understand that. And speaking of why do they hate us, the so-called war on terror launched by the 9/11 false flag, it should be called the 9/11 anthrax false flag, because the anthrax component was equally important in many respects. It's what convinced people this wasn't a one-shot, one-off deal, but that WMD would be targeting ordinary Americans consistently for the foreseeable future. Even if you didn't work at the high-rise, you had a mailbox. And that anthrax was coming supposedly out of Fort Detrick.
I wouldn't be surprised.
But, the official story there got blown up. There's a great book by Graham McQueen on this, exposing how it's clear that the 9/11 hijacker patsies were sheep-dipped in anthrax in Florida, actually getting treated for anthrax. And this was all set up so that Iraq plus Osama bin Laden would be blamed for both 9/11 and anthrax, thereby triggering this invasion of Iraq. But the story blew up for various reasons, including FBI integrity. Miraculously enough, somebody in the FBI had enough integrity to tell the truth about where the anthrax spores actually came from and who could have made them. So there's that link too. The bioweapons program is still very much alive.
Oh, absolutely.
And it appears that the anthrax spores, the super weaponized anthrax spores used on 9/11, were manufactured in Dugway Proving Ground in Utah by the Ohio company, Battelle, I believe it's called. And this was a CIA super accelerated weaponization program that was happening during the year-long run-up to 9/11. So that's another interesting tangent, speaking of war crimes and
biological weapons, yeah. I actually wrote about this also in China Rising, Ebola. I mean, who has the patent on Ebola, the Ebola virus? Well, it just so happens to be the U.S. government actually owns the patent. The U.S. military owns the patent on Ebola, and they were developing Ebola as an atomized vector, trying to disperse it through the air. in Sierra Leone and Liberia, et cetera. And when you do your research and you see how they just basically let people come into the United States, infected with Ebola just to see if it would spread, it did not do very well. But it's so obvious that the evidence is overwhelming that the United States was releasing Ebola in West Africa to test its ability to use in an atomized form, almost like a spray bottle or something like that, and then letting these people come into Dallas and in the United States. So yeah, the United States, important down in England, Fort Detrick. I have heard that there are, in fact, it was Peter Koenig, who I interviewed yesterday, was saying that, and I asked him, I said, please remember to get me the link on this, but he was saying that the West in general, including Australia, New Zealand, your Anglo land, as I like to call it, has hundreds of these test centers all over the world. And then, of course, more recently, trying to develop, where they were getting the DNA of the Russians. I guess they were getting DNA from the Russians to try to develop some kind of a bioweapon that would only kill Slavic people. So, go ahead, Tom.
No, I have read about the next generation of bioweapons with genetic markers that are tailored to specific genes and to specific ethnic groups. Yeah, it's
interesting. Well, the Israelis and the South Africans apparently were working on that. They had a joint nuclear program. There's a whole backstory there with missing nukes from South Africa that the British were supposed to be taking out that disappeared, and Israelis convinced the Americans that Saddam had them, but supposedly some of them may have ended up over in North Korea. This was one of the ways that the Israelis managed to lure the Americans into attacking Iraq, according to some intel from veterans today, for whatever that's worth. But in any case, there's targeted bioweapons for targeting specific genetic groups and ethnic groups with these bioweapons, which of course these South Africans back in the day were targeting black Africans.
Of course,
the Israelis were trying to target Arabs, but discovered that was going to be tough because a lot of their own people
they're all Semitic.
Right, they're all just Arabs. And Arab Jews are just Arabs. They speak Arabic, they're Arab Christians, they're Arab Jews, they're Arab Muslims, but the Israelis haven't figured this out yet. In any case, the future could look pretty bleak if bioweapons research continues and makes quote unquote advances, and they learn how to target specific ethnic groups and genes. This could get really ugly. One would think that there would be a movement to push the nations to have treaties on this, like with nuclear weapons. Not that those have worked particularly well.
Kevin, there is the bioweapons treaty, the bioweapons ban treaty that the Americans forced 90% of the countries in the world to sign, and then they refused to sign it. Israel refused to sign it, the United States refused to sign it, and I think England refused to sign it, and so they don't care. There is a damn treaty, and I even read the article about the guy who wrote it, and he said, it's surreal. It means nothing because the United States basically bullied, all of the members of the UN into signing it and acting like the great white savior, to stop bioweapons, and then they're over there in Sierra Leone and Liberia developing Ebola virus. So it's
crazy.
just.
Have either of you guys looked into the Cuba story? I think this is actually mentioned to some extent by the wonderful Judith Miller, who helped get us into Iraq for the New York Times. Her book Germs touches on this, but I think there are some better sources as well. It appears that in the early 60s, among all of these crazy plots targeting Castro, one of them was to hit Cuba with bioweapons, and there was supposedly a pretty well-developed plan that they expected would kill about half of the population or something and incapacitate the rest, and then the U.S. forces would go in with some sort of immunity. And I don't know, have you looked at that?
Yes, there is a very interesting volume by a gentleman named Ariel Alonso Perez, and it's called Biological War Against Cuba. And he's been writing about this and researching it for a number of years. And the U.S. has been using Cuba as sort of a target area to experiment, to test some of the developments that have come along in different animal diseases. But that book is available. It's in English and in Spanish. And I'll send you the title and the link to
it. But guys, they actually, I mean, of course, the CIA is not going to put it, on the front page of the New York Times, but very mysteriously, I think it was in 1972 or something like that. First off, the Cubans said they heard airplanes, at night, and then in the next week, the almost like a wildfire across the entire island, the swine herd was infected with swine fever. And they literally, because of that, they literally had to slaughter 800,000 pigs. They had to literally kill off every pig on the island because of the swine flu, swine fever, and it was so rapid and so widespread, and it happened over such a short period of time that the only conclusion is that it was dispersed. Through the air. So I think they have done it at least one time with the swine flu epidemic, and the fact that the Cubans literally had to rebuild their swine herd with imported livestock.
Yeah, that's true. Perez mentions that in his book, that particular episode there. And there's also another one where there was hemorrhagic dengue.
Oh, that's right, the dengue. Yeah, the dengue. That's right. Yeah, go ahead, Tom. Yeah, go ahead, Tom. Yeah, I forgot about that one.
I don't know how many people died, but close to over 250,000 people were sickened by it. So yeah, the U.S. has been regularly using Cuba as a target area to test new weapons.
Right, and we can't imagine why anybody there would think badly of us either. Well, Tom, what's your background? You mentioned you had your parents were involved in this, and maybe you could give us a sort of a quick rundown of how you got interested in this topic.
Yes, I had no idea that I would ever get interested in this topic. It was, in fact, my father's subject, and he was a newspaper. He owned a newspaper in China, in Shanghai, which he inherited from his father, who started it in 1917. But after World War II, he went back to Shanghai and reopened the newspaper. And in 1951, or 1950, when the Korean War broke out, he was adamantly opposed to the Korean War, and he took an editorial policy vehemently opposing American intervention in Korea. And then, lo and behold, here these reports come in of insects being dropped from airplanes and rodents, infected rodents, and it becomes clear that the U.S. is engaging in biological attacks in the war, and he reported this in his paper. And he got into a great deal of trouble for that the U.S. government then orchestrated sort of the closure of the paper by not allowing him to mail copies into the U.S., which was his main source of revenue, and the paper went broke, and he and my mother and my brother and I returned to the United States. And then they were, shortly thereafter, they were indicted on the charge of sedition. And it was a fairly well-known trial that occurred in 1958. The Powell sedition case. And then my father later, they actually beat that case because the judge would not allow the government to well, let me backtrack a little bit. They requested witnesses and information from China to be allowed into their court case, which the government refused to do, and the judge essentially threw the case out, and later the Department of Justice, Bobby Kennedy, tossed it out. But it was very scary time when I was a child during the McCarthy period and their sedition trial.
I can imagine. Yeah,
and of course, this was back during the hysteria of Joseph McCarthy and the who lost China, and you can imagine what his family was going through. Being called a dirty red commie, and it's just and they basically did the same thing to George Burchett's father. Wilfred Burchett. I mean, he was called a commie and a red and so I have a lot of admiration for Tom's parents, John and Sylvia Powell, and I have a lot of. In fact, I'm writing an article today because yesterday was the My Lai anniversary, and in Vietnam, and I'm going to write an article about George Burchett's father and include one of his chapters in his book about Vietnam. But I have a lot of respect for Tom and George because they could sit there and go, to hell with it. It's over and it's done with. But Tom has just done voluminous research and so that's one of the reasons that we started our American Bioweapons Truth Commission. Is we really we want justice and we want to rectify the horrific wrongs of history and seek justice and speak truth to the horrific, Western power, and clear, the Powell's names, Wilfred Burchett, and any doubt about their integrity, and also Joseph Needham. I mean, he was literally destroyed. His reputation was destroyed. One of the greatest scientists and anthropologists of the 20th century, and so yeah, this has become kind of a fun project for me, and I've really enjoyed working with Tom and all the other guys in the group. So, but Tom is the genesis. Tom is the genesis.
Well, there's a second chapter to my dad's story that I'd like to tell you. Later, after he retired, he decided to go back and start looking at this information again. And he spent 5 years researching it. And he dug up all this information about General Ishii and the Unit 731 because this was no longer in the public memory. That this had all been suppressed. And he wrote a seminal article that was
that's
published
right.
in the he wrote two articles. The first one was in a little magazine called the Bulletin of Concerned Asian Scholars, and the second one was in the let's see, what is it? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists.
Yes, that's the one I've read.
Yeah, he exposed this, and it became a big news story all over again. And it became just sort of the launching of some really serious research by a number of scholars, Williams and Wallace, Stephen Endicott, Marvin Harris, and who have produced books on this subject now. So so he finally he was vindicated, he felt.
Well, good for
so
him.
Is the mandate of your commission, this new American Bioweapons Truth Commission, is it mainly focused on Korea, or are you trying to look at the whole gamut of the abuses and crimes associated with the bioweapons program?
Well, we're going to start off with Korea and Unit 731, basically, what happened in Asia. But I'm already collecting all kinds of documents from, redacted, unfortunately, but documents from the Fort Detrick on everything from, botulism. I mean, I found like 30 files. So I think it will grow. We're going to have a global online. We're a global online library. We're having tons of stuff translated from Chinese into English that's never been seen before by Westerners. So I think it will expand. You know, I think we'll eventually take my chapter from China Rising, which is sort of a retrospective on Western, use of chemicals and biochemicals, bioweapons. And I think it will grow. I mean, George Burchett speaks fluent Russian, reads fluent Russian, and he's finding all kinds of incredible stuff, going back to World War I and, nerve gas and everything else. So this is the first step, is Korea, and I think it will expand, Kevin.
Well, that's a really important project. I congratulate both of you for doing this. I will be linking your work, including there's the story that you sent me, Jeff, which is the noose of truth is tightening around Milton Lightenberg and company's collective neck. It's a very colorful headline, and that does include links to a whole lot of important material, including the ISCR report in English as well as Chinese. So people will be able to get that through the radio blog posting about this radio show.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
For that,
thank you.
By way of truthjihad.com. Truthjihad.com. Click on the radio link, and you'll find links associated with our shows. So this is a 667-page PDF. It's got the pictures and so on and so forth. Between this and Chaddock's book, I mean, I haven't had a chance to really read this ISCR report or even really look at it, but I think there's a whole lot of smoke here, and it sure looks like there's fire. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate it. It was a great conversation. And Jeff, so look forward to having you guys back sometime, and God bless you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Jeff. Take care.
Okay. Take care. And
bye-bye.
Thank you, listeners, for pursuing the truth with me. I'll be back next week here. God willing. See you then.
Thank you.